everyone. Good evening. Welcome to 6th and I. I am Rabbi Shira Stutman. I'm one of the rabbis here on staff at 6th and I. We always begin by asking you all, by a show of hands, how many of you, is this your first time here at 6th and I? Oh, that's great. Well, welcome. And so for you newbies, I'm just going to quickly tell you the story of this building that you're in. It was built in 1908 as the second home of Addis Israel Synagogue. And after a number of years, when the synagogue moved to a new location, this building became an AME church for 50 years. And when the parishioners moved out and the building again needed to be sold, the highest bidders were actually a group of people who wanted to turn this place into a nightclub. And if you look around, it would actually be quite an amazing nightclub. But instead, a group of local philanthropists purchased this building and turned it into a Jewish spiritual center and also a home for arts and culture. So for the past 12 years, 6th and I has served as a sort of multi-denominational, non-membership space where people can come for Jewish spiritual learning and growth, and also for having conversations of the sort that we're going to have this evening with our partners in programming at The Atlantic. Really, an event like tonight really best supports our goal of building community through shared experiences and the exchange of ideas on topics that are relevant to our lives. Tonight's event is the latest in an ongoing partnership with 6th and I and The Atlantic, and it sort of brings the pages of The Atlantic to life through great conversations. I'm sure that some of you were here before when Jeffrey was here talking about his last article, or when Ta-Nehisi was here talking about one of his articles in The Atlantic last year. So the Obama Doctrine is The Atlantic's most read article of 2016, which is actually quite amazing considering how long it is. It is an article that has already generated 5 editorials in the New York Times alone. So suffice it to say that it has become a topic of conversation, I'm sure, at many of your dinner tables and on many of the talk shows. And it is a critically important article written by one of the most important journalists in America today. So in a second, I'm going to introduce Jeffrey and James and bring them up to the bima to our stage. But as we do, I just want to say, as we say in Hebrew, lehitraot, which is we'll see you soon, James, as he leaves The Atlantic and goes to New York to work on the editorial page at the New York Times. It's really been great to work with you over the years, and we look forward to having you back at some point. So without further ado, James Bennet and Jeffrey Goldberg.
Thank you, Shira, very much. We at The Atlantic love our partnership with 6th and I. I've always felt very lucky to be part of it. As Shira said, the story has gotten a ton of reaction all over the world and has brought a lot of commentary and discussion. And I thought I'd begin by reading one comment in particular. This is 2 days ago. Barack Obama speaking at the ceremony for the Toner Prize for Excellence in Political Reporting, which is a prize named in honor of Robin Toner, a very, very great political journalist. And the president said, I'll tell you, I probably maybe shouldn't do this, but what the heck, I'm in my last year. You always know as a journalist you're having a good day when a president begins with something like that. I had an in-depth conversation with President Putin a while back about Syria and Ukraine. And he had read an article in The Atlantic that Jeff Goldberg had done about my foreign policy doctrine. And he said, well, I disagree with some of the things that you said in there. And Jeff is a remarkable journalist who I admire greatly. And all the quotes that were directly attributed to me in there, I completely agreed with. I said, well, but some of the things that were shaped may not fully reflect all the nuance of my thoughts on the particular topic that President Putin was mentioning. But I pointed out to him, of course, that unlike you, Vladimir, I don't get to edit the piece before it's published. So I understand, and we can get into this, why the Kuwaitis are mad, the Saudis are mad, David Cameron's mad, the French are mad. I don't actually get why Putin would be irritated about this story.
Well, I mean, he's always mad about something, right?
So what's that about?
So one of the things that's fascinating about this moment 2 nights ago with Obama is that he was meta trolling. It was really fascinating because in my article, in these interviews that I did with President Obama, he basically trolled Putin a number of times, right? And then Putin calls him to complain about the trolling, and then he goes out and trolls Putin for complaining about being trolled, right. Which is like totally, it's the modern age, I guess, it's what happens. But I get, one of the ways that Obama's usually fairly subtle. In the piece, he referred to Putin as, quote, not completely stupid, which is...
it's kind of coming from him, it's a compliment.
Yeah, that counts as a compliment when he's talking about Putin. But I think it was sort of the overall tone of some of the things that the president communicated to me. The president believes that Putin walks into one trap after another. He may or may not be right, but that's his belief. And the thing that really gets Putin over time is when President Obama refers to Russia as a regional power. Obama's pretty good with the shiv, and he knows where people's sensitivities are. And you don't tell a czar that he's in charge of a regional power. That Putin sees himself as globe straddling. So I imagine one of the things that got under his skin was the fact when I asked the president, go through a list of challenges you think the United States faces over the next 20 years. Russia is not a top-tier problem. And Putin, if nothing else, wants to make sure that he's a top-tier problem for the United States. And I think that kind of annoyed him.
Actually, it's worth saying what he said was the #1 problem.
Well, no, this is again, you want to go back to this idea of a president in his last year.
Yeah.
Right. So at one point, I don't remember when exactly, I was with the president and I said, so explain to me your thinking about climate change versus terrorism versus the rise of China and how you sort of categorize these threats. And he, when you're on the record and you're the president, you're thinking to yourself constantly, how is this going to reverberate around the world? And I saw a moment of hesitation, and then I saw this look sort of in his eyes, like a sort of this flash, and he basically saying, oh, YOLO, right? I mean, it's like we're almost out here. So he said, climate change is an existential threat to not only the United States, but to humanity. ISIS is a serious national security threat, but essentially one that can be managed and contained and ultimately destroyed. So he definitely ranks, and this is the first time that he actually put climate change in a separate category above everything else. And he knows that's a red cape in front of a lot of people in Washington and elsewhere, mainly Washington, but he does it anyway.
Yeah, picking up on the red cape in front of people in Washington. Actually, I should have said we're going to do this for about half an hour, and then I'll open up to you guys for questions. And there are mics at the front of the room, and I'll give a warning when the time comes and people can start lining up. If you got a question for Jeff. Among the many people that are irritated or were irritated about this story, not just overseas but domestically, is basically the entire so-called foreign policy establishment in Washington. And one of the criticisms we've heard of him, based on your story, is why would a president of the United States ever muse out loud about this kind of stuff, whether it's the last year of his term
God bless
or not?
him for it, right?
No, I mean, we're grateful to him for it, but all it does is ruffle the feathers of our allies and cause problems in these relationships. So what's your answer to that question? Why would he?
First of all, when he's musing out loud, it's not my job to say, hey, Mr. President, I'm not sure you should be telling me that. My job.
This is a guy who thinks before he talks for the most part.
Yeah, no. Look, very little in what he does is not deliberate. Right. I mean, he has this. It's almost annoying, obviously, when you're with him. He has the ability to shape whole paragraphs instantly in his mind and then spit them out in order. It's he's the most linear kind of organized thinker I've ever interviewed, and really spontaneously though. I think, I'm not entirely kidding about YOLO, right? There is a kind of frustration that builds up over 7 years where you want to tell people what you actually think about the way the world is organized and the problems of the world and the problems of your critics. When you're the president, the world kind of comes in at you over time, and you become besieged a bit. Everybody's criticizing about everything, right? And so you become, even for a guy who's not emotionally needy, I think you become desperate over time to sort of explain. You know, you think you're right, and you want everybody to know it. Why is he being so blunt about not only adversaries but allies? In my experience, I mean, this is great for us, but it's probably trouble for his own staff, right? I mean, he is the first president that I can think of who is also behaving like a pundit who writes about the presidency, and the person who's occupying the presidency, who is him, you know? So there's a superscript going on in his mind where he's framing out, because he's a writer at heart, he's framing out what he's doing the way a writer would do it, and then he's happy to share it for whatever reason. He wants it out there. And so a big part of what he wanted to get across, I think, I mean, because we kept coming back to it, is this notion that the foreign policy elite and the national security establishment in Washington is a flawed establishment, and that there is something that he refers to as the Washington Playbook, which is a set of rules that govern how we respond to different challenges. One of his main critiques of the Washington Playbook is that it's an over-militarized playbook. That when we look into the toolbox, we find the Pentagon tools first. I mean, it's interesting coming from a guy who's engaged in active conflicts in 8 countries, but it's part of the complexity of his presidency. And I guess another piece of the Washington Playbook is that he believes that the foreign policy establishment makes the mistake, which is a very American mistake, of believing that every problem comes with a solution, and that it's up to America to identify the solution and impose it or work at it. He is a little bit more of a fatalist, and sometimes believes, unlike, let's say, the typical foreign policy practitioner in this city, that not every problem is fixable, and certainly not every problem is fixable by the United States.
I'll come back in a minute to the point you just made about how he sees America sort of grandly in the world. But stay with the question of your own interactions with him, and how is it that you got, I mean, you're a charming guy, you're a good-looking guy.
Yeah.
Let's stipulate all that.
Yeah, all of those things are very important in this conversation, clearly. Yeah.
How did you get him to talk?
First of all, you don't get him to talk. I mean, he makes a decision to. Well, I mean, he makes a decision to talk. Look, there is. I mean, now that it's over, I can say that, you know, and I've been talking to him periodically for several years, and so I understand his proclivities and what he likes to talk about, and the way he likes to talk about things. And
this piece is based on, in the end, about
6 hours of conversation for this piece, and then some other interviews, you know, earlier and other encounters. But I think, I mean, I want to answer this fairly and completely. I think he's bored by a lot of conversations that he has, especially around these hot-button subjects, and he's used to the sort of the press conference thing. Well, why don't you kill ISIS? Why don't you kill ISIS faster? How come you're not killing ISIS? Why, whatever. These are good questions. They're fine. You got to keep pressing at a president. But I figured I had the luxury of time, and I also am trying to understand what motivates him. So, I mean, there's a moment in the story that is sort of, it's embarrassing for me because I have difficulty formulating short questions or short answers, as you can tell. It's why one of the reasons the piece is 19,000 words, which is, by the way, short because it was 26,000 before someone made it shorter. So you can thank him. But at one point, I think it was on the plane, and it was right after Paris, and a lot of stuff is going on. And I come back come forward to the cabin and sit down, and we start talking. And I have at a previous encounter, a lunch a little while before, we had started talking about Hobbes and Leviathan and the role that the state plays in suppressing, people's innate fear. All this kind of gobbledygook, whatever. It was interesting to me, and I started bringing this up as my first question. And I had this like really prolix, confusing, complicated question. Niebuhr is in there, and Hobbes is in there, and as I'm asking it, I see there's two other people in the cabin. There's Ben Rhodes, the Deputy National Security Advisor, and Josh Earnest, who's the spokesman, the White House spokesman, and they start laughing because it's such an absurd question. And Obama basically says, look, don't ask that question in front of the rest of the press corps, but I'm happy with it. I can go with it. So you start with him, I think, because he's interested.
At a really high level.
Yeah, he's interested in the way ideas get shaped. So you start with the ideas, and then half hour into that conversation, it's Putin's not completely stupid. You get there. You get there, but you sort of wanna talk about the big picture stuff first, and he likes the big picture stuff because he is this natural born pundit in a kind of way.
Yeah, and threaded through the piece, I think one of the most interesting ideas to me is the way that he thinks about American indispensability and American exceptionalism.
Yeah.
As distinct things, and even somewhat, to some degree, kind of an interesting tension between them. You want to talk about
Sure.
how he sees it?
So there's a caricature of him, mainly a Republican caricature, but I think it's in the hawkish side of the Democratic Party. It's in Europe, it's in the Middle East, certainly, that he doesn't believe that the United States is indispensable. And this is what makes him a revolutionary president, because he's the first president who doesn't believe, certainly in the post-war period, the post-war reality created by the United States, who doesn't believe in indispensability. And I think that's wrong. I actually think that anyone who comes into the job within 2 or 3 weeks understands that America is the indispensable nation. Nothing really gets done positive in the world without America. And that's from, freedom of navigation issues in the South China Sea. There's only one country that can actually enforce freedom of navigation, to confronting Ebola. Right, and everything in between makes us we have unique capabilities, unique lift, and a unique vision of what our role traditionally has been in the world. I do think that he is, in a strange way, the first president I could think of who sometimes resents indispensability. Who, and this is not completely unusual. He's a president in a time of retrenchment. Right? Just as Eisenhower was after Korea, Nixon was in the days when he's trying to solve the Vietnam problem. Obama comes into office trying to lower our presence, lessen our presence in certain hot button places in the world, certain hot places in the world, and he didn't necessarily like it that everybody was counting on America to do everything. And that's where, if you're looking at some of the controversies that erupted out of this piece, it's when he started describing allies as free riders, that our European allies and Middle East allies in particular are people who are just kind of, as he put it, let me hold your coat, Mr. President, while you do the fighting, sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And so there is an interesting resentment there that everyone expects us to do everything, and American presidents who perpetuate that, who just go with that, are actually juvenilizing our allies in a way. This is where leading from behind was another controversy that also became caricatured over time, but there's an interesting idea embedded in leading from behind. So that's indispensability. Exceptionalism is an even more interesting question to me, and I haven't fully figured it out, but I think that this is a president who, here's a very interesting contrast with Hillary Clinton, by the way. Hillary Clinton has, I think, more of a traditional understanding of American exceptionalism. We are a uniquely gifted country born out of a noble idea, and we are indispensable, and we embrace indispensability, and we should be everywhere, and we should do everything. And it's not only our example, but our doing that makes us this totally exceptional country. Obama has some of that, but I think if you really want to understand the president's view of what makes America exceptional, you have to look at the Selma speech, because he believes to a great degree, and this comes directly to this issue of terrorism, by the way, he believes that it's America's capacity for self-correction, that we get better. We have problems. We do bad things throughout our history. Maybe this is completely inevitable that the first African-American president would have this kind of understanding of America's role in the world. But our exceptionalism is that we perfect ourselves over time. We expand rights. We become more nuanced and cultured and less tribal and less fundamentalist in our outlook in the world. And so we are, to borrow from Reagan, our role in the world is to be the shining city on the hill. And the reason I brought up terrorism is this, because one of these conversations, and I just wrote about this conversation because I find it so interesting. He believes that one of the best things we can do in the fight against Islamist terrorism is to show Muslims around the world that America is a place where devout followers of that faith can live in harmony in a Western culture as a religious minority that would be valued and honored and protected. And this is why he gets so upset about what's happening in the Republican debate about this.
And actually, there's an interesting contrast there between his lack of emotion, as you describe it, in reaction to the question about terrorist attacks.
Right.
And how emotional he gets about.
Well, this is where he gets into trouble, and I think even he would acknowledge that optically he's not very good at communicating to Americans about their legitimate fears of terrorism. Somebody very smart in these circles said to me, I thought it was a great line. He says, the problem for the president is that before you castigate the fearmongers, you have to acknowledge the legitimacy of the fear. And he's so sometimes Spockian about it and rational about it and he also believes in resilience to a great degree, that he thinks that not Brazilians, Brazilians. Yeah, Brazilians. He also believes in Brazilians very much. He's wildly pro-Brazil. He believes in resilient Brazilians, right away, extremely. He believes in that panic on the part of the president or over emotion on the part of the president doesn't lead us any good.
But so complete the thought about what he does get emotional about then.
So it's not just when somebody says we have to have special patrols of Muslim neighborhoods or whatever that line was, or we have to keep out all members of Islam, any adherents of Islam at the border, including maybe even our own citizens who are Muslim who've left the country. He not only hears that as a kind of affront to American ideals and American law, obviously, but he sees that as a betrayal of the role that he believes that we should play in this fight as the shining city on the hill. And he also, and this, by the way, he shares with the national security apparatus, almost to a person. I mean, from the CIA to DNI to Pentagon, they all understand this point that some other people running for president currently don't seem to understand, that this is a national security issue. That what ISIS wants is to convince Muslims that there is no living with the West, and there's certainly no living in the West. That it's not possible to be a good Muslim living in a place like the United States. And so, you make a simple calculation. If ISIS wants X, then we don't want that thing. We want to communicate the opposite message. And so that, I think, a lot of stuff boiled up in November, when the governors were talking about keeping Muslims out. And I think that was what got him so heated, and it got him into trouble because he was not scanning. It wasn't, his concern didn't seem to be about the actual terrorism, but about the reaction to the terrorism.
On the theme of American exceptionalism, one of the things he said to you that I just think is an astonishing thought is that he believes in multilateralism in part because he sees it as a restraint on American hubris.
Right, he said multilateralism is a check on hubris. I think it's an idea he got from Donald Trump originally, but I'm not clear. In one of Trump's treatises on international relations and the interchange.
And humility.
Yeah, and humility, his famous work on humility. Look, I mean, he is. This is another area that he's unique, and he gets into trouble, obviously, when he does this, but he can never, he very seldom will talk about another country's problems, whatever that country is, from Cuba to Egypt to Iran to Indonesia, without acknowledging that somewhere in history, the United States did something that was not good to that place, if that is indeed the case. In Argentina, he did it just last week. This obviously, he believes that this is both the right thing to do and the strategic thing to do. It opens up a conversation with people if you say, look, I know that we're not perfect. He always will do that. but it's a totally fascinating move, and it's a fairly unique move. And he does think, and this is again, I mean, not to highlight differences between Clinton and Obama, but I think she probably feels, and this is based on some conversations that I had with her, I think she feels that it's not quite so necessary to constantly, to acknowledge these past, like to embrace your story more fully, embrace the American story more fully and positively. But he also believes, and going back to your point about multilateralism, he believes that Americans sometimes, out of good intentions, rush into problems, and because we're so powerful that we can actually make those problems worse if we're not careful. So doing it with a bunch of other countries and talking to a bunch of other allies about what we're doing means that you could cool it down for a couple of weeks before you rush into a place like Syria, for instance.
So boil it down, the 19,000 words of the piece. 19,000 extremely well-chosen words of the piece.
Yeah, extremely well-chosen.
What is the Obama Doctrine?
The Obama Doctrine is the headline.
It's a really good headline.
No. So the Obama Doctrine, the reason that this is called the Obama Doctrine is because you decided that we needed a headline for a piece. And I said, I'm not sure there. No, so I said, so he's leaving the magazine anyway, so I don't care. And by the way, you're not invited back to 6 and I. I just want to say that. Go to New York, fine. So he says, we let's call it the Obama Doctrine. And I said, I'm not actually sure there is an Obama Doctrine. I mean, what the Monroe Doctrine is. You could put it on a bumper sticker. You could do Truman Doctrine. You could put it on a bumper sticker. Reagan Doctrine. This guy, the doctrine might be the doctrine of no doctrine, and then you said, well, we need a headline, so we have to call it the Obama Doctrine. And I said, fine.
The doctrine of no doctrine is still a doctrine.
Right, and no doctrine is a kind of right. No, but there is. I mean, I don't think he would. But
describe it. I mean,
I don't think that he would say that
it's an orientation, and there's a way of thinking about the world, and there's a posture that he's taken towards conflict and towards national security that I think you meaningfully differentiate as an Obama philosophy.
So you can. There's three specific things, and then there's a couple of things that are sort of more dispositional or attitudinal. Obviously, the first one, and this goes to the foreign policy establishment, is that we have a tendency in Washington to over-militarize problems, and that gets us into trouble. And so, the doctrine is think very carefully before you go to that part of the toolbox. And of course, it's interesting that this is a guy who goes to that toolbox quite frequently. So that's part of it. I think sort of looking at it regionally, or looking at it sort of globally, place by place, he came into office, first of all, as a domestic president. He didn't come in with foreign policy idea. To the extent that there was a foreign policy idea, there was obviously pull back from the Middle East, get out of Iraq. We had 180,000 troops in Iraq and Afghanistan when he came into office, and a broken economy. So he looked at those two things and said, this is completely out of whack. I have to do two things. I have to lower our exposure in the Middle East, and I've got to pivot to the part of the world where we can make money and sell things so I can build some jobs, and that, of course, is Asia. And so if there's a doctrine, it is the pivoting toward Asia as the American future. He did, and this is where things have shifted over the last 7 years, he did come into office idealistic about the Middle East. I mean, you remember the Cairo speech was an attempt to reset relations with the world's Muslims, which of course is they probably had a category error there in the kind of sense that, Muslims of the world, it's very hard to give one speech to all Muslims, but he tried. And then you move to 2011, there's the Arab Spring, and of course, any American, including this president, vibrated to what we saw on Tahrir Square and thought there's something good going on here. By 2013, after the failed Libya intervention, and when Syria is going to hell, he had radically shifted, I think, in his understanding of what was possible in the Middle East. And so the desire to rebalance toward Asia and to a lesser extent Africa and Latin America was buttressed by the fact that he wanted to move as fast as he could away from the problems of the Middle East. And here's an aspect of the doctrine. The doctrine is ruthlessly pragmatic also, which is to say, if I look at a problem and I think that I can't solve it, certainly within the span of my presidency, I'm not going to deal with it. You know, then something else came about that was very interesting, and I think he would disagree with this formulation, but once he decided that the Middle East can't be fixed, at least on his watch, or possibly for another generation, he began to rationalize that it also wasn't important. You know, that it's no longer as important as it once was, which is true on the economic front because of our energy independence, our growing energy independence. But I think that one followed the conclusion that the Middle East could not be fixed. I can't fix it. Also, by the way, I don't think it's that important anymore. So we really need to do this other stuff. You know, trade with Asia, climate change, pivoting toward the biggest challenge, biggest traditional geopolitical challenge, which is managing the rise of China. You know, so I think those are aspects of the doctrine. And there's, again, one more dispositional thing is tired of us doing everything and paying for everything. And there, you know, let's say there's a 5% overlap in the foreign policy doctrines of Barack Obama and Donald Trump. I think that's the point where they meet. And this is not an unpopular idea in America. You know, the idea that people take advantage of our largesse and our self-conception as the indispensable nation.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that last point. I'm going to ask 2 more questions about politics in this campaign. If you guys want to start lining up in the mics, if other people have questions, please, now would be a good time to charge the microphones. So yeah, talk a little bit about the Republicans in this campaign and the foreign policy that may, to the extent there is one emerging, where do you see them engaging with these ideas of the president seriously? Where do you see them completely repudiating them?
So there's this interesting thing that, and I think you felt this in the process of moving this piece, Scott Stossel, the editor of the magazine, who's editing this piece, we all felt this over the last month, which is that, you know, I would be going off and having these conversations with the president and the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, CIA, you know, all these people who are talking, really trying to grapple with what he's doing. And whether you agree with his basic outlook or not, I think, and I came to this conclusion, that you're dealing with a very intelligent, extremely intelligent person who is, in a mature way, trying to grapple with sets of very, very difficult dilemmas. Again, that's not an endorsement or a repudiation of the things that he's doing, but I think that's what you see. And then, so we're in the middle of these conversations about how to shape this. You know, I mentioned this to you in the first conversation after I came back from lunch that day. So this is Barack Obama, the writer, at heart. We were having lunch just to sort of figure out, what the story was, what I was trying to do, and a little bit of just sort of feeling it out. And I was asking questions all over the map. I mean, I was like non-linear, which is a nice way of saying I was just talking out of my whatever. And about 45 minutes in, he says, this is going to be a very difficult piece to write. And I said, because I'm like sort of a schmuck, I said, it's Brooklyn, I can't, whatever. I said, you know what, I'm going to handle the writing, and you run the United States of America, and that's the way we'll divide it up. I'll just divide it up that way, Yeah. So but he was right, of course. That was the problem. But so we're having these discussions, these very difficult discussions. How do you put this whole moment in history, telescope through the personality of this unique president into a story? And the rest of the conversation in the country is, we need to build a bigger wall, and we need to tell the Chinese to stop doing X, and we need to make Apple here, and Muslims can't, it was this kind of, this caricature of a foreign policy conversation. On the Democratic side, obviously you had one candidate who's very experienced in foreign policy, wasn't talking about it that much because no one was asking her, and you had another candidate who didn't talk about it at all because I don't think he realized that foreign policy was an aspect of running for president. I'm sorry, but it just seems that way.
But so talk about the Democrats for a second. To what extent do you think they would continue the policies of Barack Obama? Hillary Clinton was his Secretary of State. Does she see the world the same way that?
Look, Hillary Clinton, this is what's so interesting about this moment is that, there are, let's say 4 main candidates left standing. I don't think Kasich too. The 4 main candidates left standing. Hillary Clinton, who represents something closest to sort of foreign policy establishment thinking, is a bit of the outlier, right? Bernie Sanders is one direction. Ted Cruz is doing something else. obviously Donald Trump is doing something completely different. I mean, sorry, I can't help myself. I mean, this is a fascinating moment in history because we've never had a candidate come this close to the presidency who actually doesn't know anything about the way the world is organized or the role that the United States played as setting up the international. No, I'm not. You know, it's just, and it's not an ideological comment. It's just a kind of observable reality comment. He doesn't know why NATO exists. You know, and what role it has traditionally played in ensuring stability, the transatlantic stability, right? So there's that. But that was just a parenthetical.
Yes, close the parentheses.
So, parenthetically, the world is coming to an end, and let me close parentheses and then go back to your question. So we are in this moment, and this is the key question I think that you have to come out with over the next 9 months to a year. Is the Obama retrenchment, are his ideas, are they ultimately aberrational, or are they a sign of things to come? Hillary Clinton, I think, would yank back things a little bit, maybe 10 degrees toward a more centrist, somewhere between, a mainstream Republican and a mainstream Democratic kind of foreign policy. She definitely has more of a bias toward action. She definitely has a less complicated narrative about America's traditional role in the world than he does. But she stands for that. But the other three main candidates at this point are totally out of the traditional norm. And so I think all these questions, I said the other day on one of these shows, I said, I think if you spent 20 seconds explaining why the United States has 36,000 troops in South Korea and why it's important to keep them there, most Americans would understand that. And the person I was talking to is much bigger expert on domestic politics, says, I'm not so sure that's true anymore. I think we are moving into this strange period where a lot of the underlying assumptions that have governed the way we operate in the world are being questioned by more and more Americans. So I don't know what's going to happen in the next year. I do know that our diplomats and trade negotiators and people like that are currently using the rise of Trump to their advantage by going to foreign leaders and saying, look, you've got 9 months to make this deal, or else who knows? Who knows what's going to happen?
Maybe we should have called it the Obama retrenchment.
The Obama retrenchment.
Sounds even more like a Ludlum novel. All right, let's go to the questions. Please ask your question in the form of a question, because there are a lot of people I think we're going to want to ask. Please go ahead.
2 questions. 1, how'd you get this interview and pick this topic? And 2, Obama's probably the most denigrated president in history in terms of the insults and the 24/7 constancy and so on. Enough to fell any mortal. How do you sense he holds up or deals with or copes with? Does it shatter his self-confidence in any way? Does it cause him anger? It's my second question.
Thank you.
He's a pretty self-confident guy, from what I can tell. I don't know if historically that is true. Certainly the 24-hour-a-day nature of the criticism and having Twitter and social media and 24-hour cable news means that the denigration that you're talking about is constantly there. But I mean, the 18th century, pretty rough. 19th century, there are points that were pretty rough. The Civil War period, for instance, was pretty rough on a certain president. I think, this is one of the, you could trace an arc of disillusionment in any presidency. You come in thinking you're going to change the world. Hope and change, obviously, was a theme. There are specific disappointments in different regions of the world and different problems that he hasn't been able to fix. I think, this is speculation on my part, but I think he did think that that certain parts of the country would be more open and more respectful of his ideas. And I think, again, this is pure speculation on my part. I'm not attributing it to him or anyone. I think he probably does understand Trump in a particular way as a particular form of white backlash toward not only his election, which I think surprised a lot of. I was in Texas last week and I was talking to some people in politics, and they told me that there are huge swaths of Texas where no one knows anyone who ever voted for Obama. And so there was a lot of surprise that Obama became president, and that's why this kind of phenomenon that you're talking about happened. And so I think he might understand that in a kind of way. You know, again, he is very self-confident, and he feels very, you have to be. He's also a very cool character, as people know. And he doesn't have, and I think he said this in various ways, you know, the highs aren't very high and the lows aren't very low. But on the other hand, you know, and I think this is evinced in the story and other things that you'll see, and I think we're going to see this more as the year progresses, he is not going to be holding back quite so much when he thinks that something has been directed at him that's particularly stupid or nasty. Very quickly on your first part, again, I mean, we talked about this a little bit. I've been covering him for years. We've had these foreign policy conversations before, and you know, I said it would be an interesting time. He's a longtime reader of The Atlantic. I think that's, I mean, before he was famous, you knew that, and he knew that we would at least be fair and comprehensive, and I think there is, despite that coolness, there is a real desire to explain himself in whole paragraphs. So I think we afforded that possibility.
So you asked. You asked for the interview.
Yeah. Many times, actually.
Yeah. I mean, over and over, you know. I mean, no, they always say, yeah, but, you know, then you just have to get him on the calendar.
Let's go to the next question.
He's busy, you know.
Joan Michelson, Green Connections Media. By the way, I lived in North Dakota for a couple of years, and there are whole parts of North Dakota that never voted for Obama either. One quick question and then another real question. First of all, did you record everything? You did, okay. And second of all, why did he do health care first? He had all this political capital. I understand it's 16% of the budget, et cetera. But, you know, he had John Podesta, you know, right there, who's been pushing climate change and energy innovation. We still don't have an energy policy in this country. That could have created an enormous number of jobs. Why do you think that he chose health care and just completely going all out, determined to do this at almost all costs?
Well, this is one of those moments when I'm glad I'm not Josh Earnest. I don't know. All I know is that he was. This is the interesting thing as it intersects with foreign policy. This is interesting because he didn't come into office as a foreign policy president. He doesn't want to leave office as a foreign policy president. He had a domestic agenda to do. So, I have no idea. You got to go ask somebody in the White House.
Okay.
Please, sir.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Excuse me. Okay, I have a quick factual question and then a variant.
Everybody has very complicated sort of organizational. Yeah.
That's the prologue, and the non-governmental foreign policy establishment. Who are these people? Who supports them? Where do they get their money? That's the quick one.
No
But
I have a PowerPoint for you that it's 93 different slides.
then the variant is, I mean, in doing foreign policy, you're sometimes asking that people die and asking people to get killed, and you're dealing with terrible people sometimes. And I'm just wondering, what is the emotional side of Obama about that part of the job?
That's a good question.
And where are there people that he turns to for emotional support? His wife, the vice president, and so on. Or does he need such people?
Yeah.
So those are my two questions.
Quickly on the first part, the people who are in the foreign policy establishment in the sort of the think tank constellation, I mean, you know the names, Brookings and CSIS and AEI and Carnegie and all these places. They are generally people who've been in government in previous administrations or even in this administration and are going to go back in future administrations. It's kind of a revolving door. A particular, I mean, I've heard this in the White House. There is this. One of the conclusions that some of the people around the president have come to, and I wrote about this, is that one of the reasons we are, as a town, overly obsessed with the Middle East is that a lot of Gulf countries put a lot of money into think tanks. There's obviously a pro-Israel component in parts of the think tank world, and so when you give money to a think tank, you want them to think about the thing that you think about, and so that's one of the theories of the case why we're overemphasizing the Middle East in the way we think about the world. On your second point, look, I didn't write this. I should have put this at the end of the story because, so a lot of people are very, very critical of his foreign policy, and I'm critical of aspects of his foreign policy too. There's a part of this that we don't see. Well, there's two parts that we don't see during the day. The first part is, and try to imagine yourself as the president. You have a meeting of your economic advisors at 9, and then the winner of the Girl Scout who sold the most cookies comes in for a picture at 10, and then the Prime Minister of Latvia needs 10 minutes, and then someone walks into your office and says, there's 7 guys in a pickup truck in Yemen who we need to kill in the next 8 minutes, and here's who they are, or here's who we think they are, and if you don't kill them, they might blow up an airplane. What do you want to do? There's a serious. I mean, this is a hidden. It's hidden away from us, right? But this is what he deals with every day. The flip side of that, and so that has to be sort of emotionally wearing, even on a cool hand Luke kind of president. The other part is, and this is very important. I think, and this is me putting words into his mouth. I think that he feels that any day that goes by in which an American soldier or Marine or airman or someone in the Navy is not killed in the Middle East is a victory for the United States and a victory for his presidency, right? And he has spoken, I think, very feelingly, and there are a lot of generals who will tell you that for such a cool character, when he goes to Walter Reed, it actually really tears him up. And this goes to this debate over action versus inaction, right? I mean, the one way to organize your thoughts about the last 16 years is, President Bush's sins in the international arena were sins of commission, and Obama's sins might be the sins of omission. But from his perspective, I think the fact that today, for best as I know, no one died. No one who works for him in the military died pursuing a policy. He considers that a victory. On your other point about where he seeks solace, I have only the barest of inklings on that, and I wouldn't speculate.
Let's go over here.
I'm wondering, especially in the context of the Latin America trip recently, and sort of understanding the world's perspectives and how we look to them versus how they look to us. Is it possible that just given his background, and I think there was, with Netanyahu, there was a comment where he was frustrated with saying, like, I understand, I'm the first black president and I come from a single mother, I get it.
I got here, yeah.
Is it possible that he just has more perspective than our previous presidents and is just frustrated with sort of this need to believe that we're the greatest thing on earth? And that he's done a lot to help.
Yeah, like some of this, as I said, I think is inevitable in a way. If you're an African-American president, you can't go around the world acting as if we're perfect. Certainly, historically, you can't go around acting as if we're perfect. I think his biography, I think his appearance, I think a lot of those things do work well on certain kinds of people. But I think it's actually more disposition in the Latin America sense, and I think this has been very effective. He said this to me once. I thought this was very interesting. He said, I have to go to these summits of the Americas, and President Ortega in Nicaragua gets up and gives like an hour-long Marxist harangue or whatever, and I just sit there and I smile and it's fine. And then we do business. And then opening up Cuba removed the stone from the shoe in a kind of way with relations with various Latin American countries. So always thought that the U.S. was being hypocritical in its treatment of Cuba. I think people do look at him across the developing world in a different way. I think he's been effective in sort of low-keying that, certainly Latin America. And Africa, which I didn't talk about very much, again, because the Middle East is consuming in a certain way. But in Africa, he's playing a very, very interesting role that people really haven't written that much about, which is that he is both mentoring a lot of, or several rulers, several presidents across Africa, and he's being very, very judgmental about the way people rule in Africa. I mean, if you saw his speech in Addis Ababa last year, he basically goes on like a half-hour harangue about, the need for presidents to leave the presidency. And he did a whole spiel about how I can't wait to get out of the presidency. I'm looking forward to my post-presidency, and you should too. And he got huge applause because that's building up in Africa as a kind of complaint about leadership. And I think his biography and his appearance and all of that together really make him a very effective sort of advocate for policies that actually are mainstream American ideas, but sometimes are probably communicated pretty ineffectively or probably communicated with a little bit too much hubris.
And Hawaii and Indonesia are part of that.
What?
Hawaii and Indonesia are part of that biography as well.
Right. Well, look, he came from the outside looking in, right? And then he worked his way toward the center, but he had this different way of looking at the world.
Please, sir.
Thank you. I guess, I understand the retrenchment, and that was very well articulated. But in regard to inaction, what about the concern of the issue that inaction actually can make things worse and not better? Specifically, say, in Ukraine, did you ask him why the United States hasn't done more to promote economic development in Ukraine, even if we don't provide military assistance to the troops in the east that are fighting the Russians? And in regard to Syria, did you ask him about, granted we don't want to put troops on the ground, but what about a no-fly zone or some more robust help to local groups that could fight Assad harder than we would ever wish to get involved in? Did you press him on those points? Because I think a lot of the nuance and a lot of the difference that you hear within the foreign policy establishment isn't on the delta between 1 and 10. It's actually between whether we're at 2 and we go to 3 or 4. It's actually fairly nuanced. But those distinctions are important, especially helping Ukraine, what we might have been able to do for the rebels some years ago. So did you press him on those points, and how did he respond?
Much of the article is about Ukraine and Syria, so yes, obviously. And I think you're making an interesting point in that a lot of the criticism of President Obama and the way he sort of talks about, the way he lawyers these issues in public is that he erects straw men. And he says, well, if you want to send an army in to invade Syria, fine, but I don't, rather than sort of intermediate steps. He would argue, I think, and this was the back and forth that we had, he would argue that we are actually doing more than people credit him with. I mean, there's obviously a whole raft of sanctions on Russia related to Ukraine. And in Syria, some of the, going back to this point about pieces of the presidency that you don't see. We do have a secret army of 10,000 Syrian rebels run by the CIA that is fighting the Assad regime. I mean, but he's not allowed to talk about it by statute, right? We can talk about it because we still live in a free country. So you're hitting at the key criticism, which is this: if you think through the second, third, and fourth order consequences of any proposed move, you will run into a disaster, a theoretical disaster eventually. In the Middle East, in specific, and this is how he comes out on this. In the Middle East, specifically on Syria, he sees the Middle East as this vast slippery slope. He knows that we've had disastrous encounters in the Middle East over the last 25 years or more, and he doesn't want to put one foot on the slope because you just go right down. In Ukraine, and this was obviously one of the most controversial things that he said to me, and this is a very interesting thing for a sitting president to acknowledge. He basically said that Ukraine falls in Russia's sphere of influence. Now, we as the superpower never acknowledge that there is such a thing as spheres of influence in the world. Nobody has a sphere of influence. But he basically said, look, if anyone ever argues that, Russia, that Ukraine will always come under, that Ukraine will somehow escape coming under the domination of Russia, they're kidding themselves. And they're also kidding themselves if you think that we will get into an escalatory cycle with Russia over Ukraine. And so, again, he looks at the second, third, fourth tier consequences of things. In Syria, he sees a slippery slope leading to some sort of Vietnam or at least Iraq situation. And in Ukraine, he sees that Russia has escalatory dominance. So he doesn't even want to go that far down the road because he knows that Russia considers Ukraine to be a core national security interest, and he knows that the United States doesn't consider Ukraine to be a core national security interest. Again, this is a recipe for prudence. It's also a recipe for paralysis, and that's the essential dilemma.
I think you're next, sir. I'm not sure. I've lost track of the sequence.
No, I think over
on this
here.
side. You are? Okay, please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Igor Dunayevsky. I work for a Russian newspaper. As you have mentioned in the beginning of the event, Obama used the article in the conversation with President Putin. But I think I've seen some commentators putting Obama's comments in doubt. I mean that he made unscripted good line in conversation with Putin. And I have seen you replied in your Twitter that from what you had seen, Obama is actually quite good at making unscripted lines. So could you maybe give some colorful example of like this in Obama making like good unscripted lines with in conversations with other world leaders? And second, maybe more personal for you. I worked here for 3 years, and as you described, Obama used your article to troll Putin on freedom of press. But I've also heard from many colleagues here that compared to previous administrations, they don't tend to consider Obama administration as the most friendliest towards the press. I've even seen some headlines.
Toward the press?
Yeah,
okay.
I've seen even headlines in newspapers like New York Times saying that Obama hates the press, he is an enemy #1 for press, he hates leaks, he gives little press conferences. So would you agree with that? Where would you place, as a journalist, as a professional journalist, where would you place current administration and Obama himself?
On the issue of press access or press?
Yeah, the Trump was able to get this and make a story, essentially. Thank you.
I don't know, James could probably answer that as well as anyone. You've seen the complaints, and obviously a lot of the complaints that you're talking about specifically this week have to do with the FOIA requests and how the administration is very slow on FOIA. And probably could speed it up. I don't think they hate the press. I think every administration, this has just been the pattern in Washington over the last 20 or 30 years. Every administration is tighter than the last administration on press management, and I think that they've followed that pattern. There was a lot, this speech that he gave a couple of nights ago was about responsibility in the press and press freedom, and a lot of people I saw were pushing back saying, we don't need your lecture on press freedom. I obviously am in a strange position of not being able to complain about access to the president at the moment, so I'm probably not the best person to ask that. There's also the reality that they've exploited, which is that there are so many other ways for him to communicate to Americans and to others without the filtration of the traditional media, the traditional press, that he can do Jerry Seinfeld and Between Two Ferns, and he could go to Mark Maron's garage and do a podcast, and there are all kinds of ways, and those are obviously softer, friendlier things than the constant, why did you do the tango in Argentina after Brussels, or why aren't you doing more against ISIS? But I'm not going to act like if I were working in the White House in press management, I wouldn't try to exploit that as well. It seems like something that they would do. I don't think I understood your first part of your question that well. I would say when I tweeted that, and I love being held accountable for tweets, by the way. Again, if you needed another reminder never to tweet, there's another reminder. One of the misunderstandings about Obama, and this has obviously been perpetuated, you see it a lot on Drudge, places like that, is that he's always using a teleprompter, that he's not spontaneous at all. He's actually, he can riff quite well for hours without any help whatsoever. I always tell this story, and you know this story. So in 2012, I interviewed him on Iran. It was a key moment in his deliberations about what to do about Iran. And I went into the West Wing lobby to check in, and Tom Donilon, who was then the National Security Advisor, was walking through. So we said hello, and we talked for a couple minutes. And I said, so I'll see you in there in a few minutes, I guess, meaning the Oval Office. And he says, oh, no, I'm not going. And I said, we're about to do an hour-long conversation about Obama's posture toward the Iranian nuclear program, and you're not going. And he's like, no, he's got it. He's got it. And the truth is, he got it. I mean, he did. I mean, so it's always been, you're always impressed by things that you can't do yourself. And like, so to walk that high wire, we on the record, 100% on the record, tapes are running, and so if you fall off that, that's not like talking about healthcare. You fall off that high wire, press conference the next day, they fix it. You fall off a wire when you're talking about U.S. naval activities in the Persian Gulf designed to stem the spread of Iranian fundamentalism, and you make a mistake, that's a big deal.
Hi, thank you so much for doing this. So you kind of seem to characterize Obama as being less militaristic, less kind of belligerent, but this has kind of come at a time when he's essentially merged the DoD and the CIA, the NSA,
right,
and made them kind of very responsible for military operations. And I mean, it didn't seem like that was discussed a whole lot in the article. I can't quite remember.
That was the part that was cut by Bennett.
Okay. But,
all the best stuff was cut.
Do you think that Obama has done too much to maybe make this huge part of foreign policy, military intelligence, to make it even more opaque than it already was? And do you think that, at the same time, he's not holding people like John Brennan accountable for doing things that are pretty contrary to what he would consider to be acceptable?
Not necessarily, but you do. I have a feeling. No, you raise. So here, I think we dealt with it a little bit in the story. And this is interesting. There's this someone, I forgot, someone in Europe told me this. Some foreign minister or something said. He said, the only people. This is related to the pivot. The only people who don't believe that the United States is pivoting toward Asia and away from Europe and the Middle East are the Asians. And the reason I thought of that is because of the following formula. The only people who actually credit President Obama with being the person I describe as the foremost terrorist hunter in the history of the American presidency are the people on the left who don't like it. You know what I mean? It's a fascinating thing, and it goes to this issue of frustration. It's like on the right, they think of him as a Birkenstock wearing whatever kumbaya kind of guy, but he is. I'm sure he wouldn't like to be described this way because it doesn't fit an image, but he's a fairly ruthless killer of people he thinks, or that the apparatus thinks, are terrorists. And so I think you're onto something, but for me it's a little bit more subtle. The lesson he learned from Iraq was not that the United States should not kill people. The lesson is that you do it in a very discreet, silent, stealthy, quick way. You don't do it with tanks and invasion forces. You do it at night. You do it with drones. I mean, I was really struck by, there was one quote in the story from Ben Rhodes, who is his deputy national security advisor, who said, I'm paraphrasing. I don't want to get the quote wrong. Basically said, this is a president who doesn't have a second thought about using drones. It doesn't conform to certainly the way the right understands him, and it doesn't please the left, but it's sort of right down the middle. He sees it as being right down the middle. I don't know if that answers your question. I certainly would just say on the John Brennan question, he loves John Brennan, and that obviously upsets a lot of people on the left to no end. But I think, and again, I think it's an important point to make, and one of the things we have to do as citizens is try to understand a little bit more about what the president actually does and what he would be blamed for not doing. The president begins every day with a daily PDB, the Presidential Daily Briefing, which is this parade of horribles. You know, overnight, our intelligence has gathered the fact that this group here wants to kill X number of Americans, this group here wants to blow this up, this group here, you know, in Europe this is happening, in the Middle East happening. The president starts every day by knowing that there are people out there trying to kill Americans. And so I think, I mean, maybe this is, I don't want to put something on a person I don't really know, but I think Bernie Sanders as president, you know, after the first PDB, he'd probably go, oh, wow, but that's really bad stuff. Are you sure it's true? And this is why it's true? And here's the intelligence, and this is how we know it, and you have to make a decision. And I think most people who become president who realize that they're responsible for keeping Americans alive, that's their basic responsibility, would act in much the same manner that Obama's acting.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Okay.
Thank you again for hosting this discussion. At the beginning of your article, you talked about Brent Scowcroft, who was HW's national security advisor. And I was just wondering, you know, what about Scowcroft's ideology did Obama want to emulate, and how did his staff react in kind of the real-time discussions?
This is a really interesting point, because it goes to this question of what we want to believe a presidential candidate is. So in Audacity of Hope, the second book, which was the campaign primer, basically, right? Late 2006, early 2007, I guess, comes out. And in this book, he writes that Brent Scowcroft and George H.W. Bush are, for him, models of what foreign policy, national security presidents should be, right? And so these guys are the opposite of hope and change, right? I mean, this is Brent Scowcroft is a national security advisor who 5 weeks after Tiananmen Square goes to Beijing and does a banquet, toasts the leaders of China and promises to smooth out relations, and we'll get through this human rights problem together and it'll all be fine, right? But we decided as a collective that Barack Obama was all hope and change, right? So how could he possibly do that? But it's right there. It's there all along. And I've always been fascinated by that. What he likes about Scowcroft and Bush I's foreign policy is restraint. And again, I didn't get into it enough in the piece, but I should have. He likes about them that when the Soviet Union collapsed, they, quote, didn't spike the football. You know, they didn't do a victory dance on the grave of communism. They just like, okay, what do we do now to make sure that these transitions work? In Iraq, they didn't invade Baghdad. They didn't overthrow Saddam. They knew, from his perspective, they knew when to stop. And I think it's about restraint, but it's also about something else, which is, again, I find it dispiriting when you think of him in the context of being a hopeful, uplifting president. He's also Niebuhrian in the sense that he really does believe in man's sinful and fallen nature, and believes that bad things happen, and this tragic realism of his approach leads him to not intervene in a way that, say, a Samantha Power, who works for him now, would intervene. So he's adopted a lot of the Scowcroft vision of the world, which is, you know, don't spike the football. He hates that part of it, obviously. Know when to stop. Know when not to do something. Deal with states as they are, not as you want them to be. And also, don't inject too much moralizing into the creation of foreign policy, because that will lead you on a slippery slope. He does not believe that George W. Bush, he believes him to be a tragic figure, I think, but he does not believe him to be a liar. He didn't lie us into war. He wasn't motivated by a malevolent urge. He was motivated by a good, very American urge. He saw a bad dictator and wanted to get rid of him. But Obama, going to the Scowcroft Playbook, says, it's not our business, we don't have the capacity, we don't have the staying power, we don't have the knowledge, and we're just gonna muck it up. You know, and that's, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I find that to be, I mean, you could write a whole book about why the candidate from Hope and Change worships a Brent Scowcroft who is completely devoid of any romance, in the way the world is organized.
I mean, you write that in that book he had to be reminded to say something nice about Bill Clinton's
Well, that was a separate thing. Yeah, no, there's a very funny moment, in the writing of that book. He was going on so much that Susan Rice, who was then helping him write the book, who's now the National Security Advisor, had to remind him to say something nice about Bill Clinton, because Clinton was actually the last Democratic president, so you have to be nice about the Clintons too. And so he wrote like a line like, Bill Clinton was a really good foreign policy president too, and then went back to Scowcroft or something like that.
Yes, sir.
He was also worried about Hillary. I think there was also a little bit of a...
This is a very less serious question than all those. What was your conversation like about Hobbes and the Leviathan? What did you guys talk about? Just curious.
Just a light question about Hobbes and Leviathan.
It was Calvin and Hobbes.
Yeah, Calvin and Hobbes, yeah. Oh, they think it's Thomas Hobbes. Oh, sorry, man. Thomas Hobbes. So he actually brought Leviathan up in a conversation. I didn't bring it up, but I was fascinated that he would bring it up. Because again, I'm gonna butcher. There's probably some Hobbes scholar in the room, and I'm going to butcher this, but Hobbes is the Leviathan, the state, suppresses man's chaotic and fear-driven instincts, right? So that's the role of a strong state is to keep that in control. Hobbes argues that the thing that unifies all humans is this supreme fear of death. And that makes us all a little bit crazy, and it makes us very fearful. And the Leviathan, in the form of the state, keeps that under wraps. And what we were talking about at the time, if I recall correctly, was the idea that weak states are so much more dangerous to America than strong states. Because in weak states, and this is describing the greater Middle East, obviously, in weak states, people revert back to primal identities. Rather than organizing themselves as Egyptians or Libyans or Iraqis or Afghanis, they organize themselves by tribe, by sect, by clan, by family, right down to the village level, and then it becomes the Hobbesian war of all versus all. And so, he is, and by the way, you could totally see why a president who thinks in these terms, when someone comes to him and says, we need to fix Afghanistan, he says, are you kidding? Like you want me to fundamentally reorganize a society that's built on fear-driven sectarianism? I can't do that. I can go kill some dudes in Al-Qaeda, right? But I can't do that. And so that was where so you combine that kind of, again, this goes to the question of, does that motivate you to do something, or does that paralyze you when you realize that this is what you're fighting is the natural state of man in places where there's been societal breakdown? He came to the conclusion that it's not America's job to rebuild these societies from the ground up, and you combine that with his Niebuhrian instinct, which is that the world is a tragic things happen in this fallen world, and that you can't stop them from happening, and the attempt to go stop them, that does lead you to sort of say, I'm gonna have a foreign policy that's restrained, and a foreign policy in which I ask over and over again, if we take this action, what are the bad things that can happen as a consequence of this action? So that was sort of what that conversation was.
It's a great point to end on, because it really is the intellectual foundation of his worldview.
Right. Right.
So thank you. I'm sorry we didn't have more time for questions. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Tonight. Congratulations, Jeff.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you.